Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Xavier Legette, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 5 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average, so we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After which, we'll transition to talking about my top 43 wide receiver rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. Do not forget that rankings are subject to change. This upcoming Sunday morning, I will be live streaming here on the channel starting at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Do not forget, there is a London game starting at 6:30 a.m. PST, so make sure to get your lineup set. But for those of you interested in getting your questions answered, you can swing on by Sunday morning. Or, again, I live stream every single day on this channel, so you can swing on by in those circumstances. So be sure to subscribe. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content. If you're interested, be sure to subscribe. We are very close to achieving 90,000 subscribers. Cannot thank you guys enough for all the support. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. Thus far this season, the Commanders, Vikings, Lions, Eagles, and Jaguars are at the top of this overall conversation in regards to wide receiver receiving statistics allowed in regards to receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns in a half PPR scoring format. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take advantage of the Detroit Lions or Eagles matchup, as both those teams, along with the Tennessee Titans and Los Angeles Chargers, are on bye week in Week 5. Therefore, we won't be able to take advantage of them, and we will be going after these alternative matchups. Again, Amari Cooper and Jerry Jeudy taking on the Commanders, incredible. Hopefully, Garrett Wilson can find himself far more success taking on the Minnesota Vikings secondary, who of course have been torched over the course of the season, primarily because they're forcing their competitors to have to throw for majority of the games because of the leads that they take early on. Either way, we'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode in regards to some of the more advantageous matchups. I also want to show some of the more difficult matchups, taking on the Denver Broncos, the Bills, the Tennessee Titans. These secondaries have been great all season long, and oftentimes teams are either running the ball on them or just having a tough time in general moving the ball, considering how great they have played defensively. Either way, just wanted to go ahead and present these statistics. We'll refer back to them in just a moment. Again, do not forget, while you're down in the description, being able to find those players in regards to timestamps or subscribing to the channel. Be sure to check out Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, but you're going to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, flex, half PPR, full PPR. So for those of you who are interested in taking advantage of the opportunity, getting my rankings every single Sunday morning to help set your lineups, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And if in fact you are not eligible, you've used the code in the past in a prior season, whether it's my code or somebody else's code, you can also check out the Patreon link down in the description, where you can find unlimited questions in my direction where I'll answer them, and of course finding those rankings. Thank you very much. And of course, make sure to be able to take advantage of 0.5 total yards. It's a free pick for new customers who sign up today using code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings, beginning with our number one, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. The fact of the matter is, he's an automatic start every single week, coming off a performance in which he had 7 grabs for 98 and a touchdown. But quite frankly, it was an underwhelming performance, primarily because in the second half of that game, there was no production out of him. He quite literally only had 2 targets in the second half. When you go back to the 2023 season, even including the NFL playoffs against the Green Bay Packers, in the final 12 games of the 2023 season for CeeDee Lamb, all 12 of those games consisted of 9 or more targets. The volume of opportunity was consistently there. He was averaging over 11 targets per game. So if we can get back into that overall conversation, giving him more opportunities in terms of targets on a weekly basis, I understand that he had a couple rushing attempts, but those are not the opportunities that we're looking for going forward. And hopefully in a negative game script, it is going to elevate his overall potential, taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers secondary. Again, an automatic start and somebody that should find himself a lot of success within the week. Number 2 is Nico Collins, who truly has now elevated himself into the elite wide receiver conversation. Last season finished as a wide receiver 1, but what he's been able to accomplish thus far this season has really elevated him. When we look at the last 8 games that Nico Collins has played, 7 of those games have consisted of him getting 85 or more total yards. He's the number 1 wide receiver in NFL right now in terms of total yardage. And of course, he's going to continue to dominate defenses. I don't care that he takes on the Buffalo Bills and it's a tough matchup. The volume of opportunity he continues to get makes him matchup proof, and the talent that he is, and he's really become being a full all-around top-tier wide receiver, makes him an automatic play every single week. Moving on to our number 3. Speaking of being an all-around receiver in the elite overall conversation, we have Malik Nabers. The volume of opportunity he continues to get makes him matchup-proof and makes him elite. That is just the fact of the matter. Thus far this season, he leads all wide receivers in terms of total targets with 52 and total receptions with 35. When you go ahead and compare those 35 receptions to start an overall career, In the first 4 games of a career, there's only one other wide receiver who's had more receptions within their first 4 games. That being Puka Nacua, who of course broke the record for most receptions and receiving yards in a season by a rookie. So obviously Nabers is slowly but surely catching up to him within that overall category. Obviously Malik Nabers is still in the concussion protocol. Hopefully he'll be able to clear that by the time we get into Sunday's matchup against the Seattle Seahawks. To close out the S tier, we have Justin Jefferson, who's coming off of 4 consecutive games of scoring a receiving touchdown, primarily because Sam Darnold has played incredibly well. Of course, Sam Darnold, in every single game thus far this season, 2 or more touchdowns. The last 2 games, 3 or more touchdowns. So if, in fact, we're going to be in a situation where Sam Darnold is taking on a revenge game against his former team, the New York Jets, and he has an opportunity of doing so in London, usually these London games are weird, but we're anticipating that Justin Jefferson, regardless of who's covering him, to find himself a lot of success. They're going to scheme him in ways to get open and find an opportunity to make it 5 consecutive games in which he's able to score a receiving touchdown. Our number 5, to begin the A tier, is DK Metcalf, who's coming off of 3 consecutive weeks of 100 or more receiving yards. After a dud performance in week 1, has been incredible ever since. And even in Monday's game against the Detroit Lions, was 1 yard away from scoring a touchdown for 3 consecutive weeks. Now he approaches a matchup against the New York Giants, which quite literally everyone is taking advantage of. CeeDee Lamb, 7 catches, 98 and a touchdown. Amari Cooper, 7 catches, 86 and 2 touchdowns. Justin Jefferson, 59 and a touchdown within that overall game. DK Metcalf is poised for another big performance here against the Giants secondary. Number 6, we have Ja'Marr Chase. Taking on the Baltimore Ravens is definitely not going to be an easy matchup overall, primarily because the Baltimore Ravens are going to take a commanding lead. Because their running game and the lack of run-stopping ability from the Cincinnati Bengals, there's going to be a lot of clock being bled out early in that overall contest. And if the Baltimore Ravens take that lead, it is going to force a negative game script on the hands of Joe Burrow and this passing attack. So they're going to have to air it out for a lot of the overall second half, I would assume. And if, in fact, they're going to do so, hopefully it'll lead to far more opportunity than what Ja'Marr Chase saw last week, which was 6 total targets and only 3 receptions. If it wasn't for the fact that he took, that 13-yard reception for 63 yards and a touchdown, he would have had himself a dud performance. But again, he's an elite and very much so capable receiver going up against the matchup, which is the 10th best at the position, as the Ravens are allowing nearly 30 fantasy points per game and a half PPR to opposing wide receivers. Number 7 is Chris Godwin, the thumbnail of today's episode. By far and away my favorite potential underdog pick'em play of the week going into tomorrow night's overall contest against the Atlanta Falcons. The fact of the matter is, the Atlanta Falcons cannot stop opposing slot receiving options. Thus far this season, Dee Alford, the primary slot nickel cornerback of the Atlanta Falcons, has been torched. He has allowed the most targets, receptions to opposing slot receivers, and the second most yards and touchdowns to opposing slot wide receivers. Rashid Rice, 12 catches, 110 and a touchdown. Devontae Smith, 7 catches for 76 and a touchdown. Both Palmer and McMillan on this team are out and designated out. The expectation is a lot of production out of Chris Godwin and, of course, Mike Evans. Number 8, we have Jayden Reed, another one of these slot receiving options that continues to find success. I mentioned it this time last week, and I told y'all you either trade for him now or it's over. You're not going to be able to get him back on your roster, primarily because, again, the return of Jordan Love was going to elevate him, and it did exactly that. 8 targets, 7 grabs, 139 and a touchdown. Thus far this season, in the last 2 games with Jordan Love in the lineup, 130 yards minimum and 1 touchdown minimum in these overall games. Now has an opportunity of taking on the Los Angeles Rams, who are the 9th best matchup at the position, allowing over 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. There is a possibility where Wicks and Doubs have themselves incredible performances against this defense, but I'm anticipating a huge overall week from Jayden Reed, once again, the number 1 receiving option for this offense. Number 9, we have Diontae Johnson, who really has taken over the league. In the last 2 weeks with Andy Dalton, he is ranked as the number 6 and the number 9 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. Incredible overall production, primarily because the opportunity share is there. He has been able to get himself 35% of the target share within this offense. Can you imagine? That is a ridiculous volume. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, weeks 3 and 4 with Andy Dalton, Diontae Johnson is number 3 in terms of wide receiver air yards. As long as the opportunity share is going to continue to go in his direction, regardless of the upcoming matchup against the Chicago Bears, who of course have a great secondary, the anticipation is continued success for Diontae Johnson within the week. Moving on to the beginning of the B tier, we have Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel didn't see himself any rushing opportunities, so it almost was a decoy Samuel week, but hopefully, now that he gets more practice under his belt, and hopefully he's going to be at a full healthy standard going up against the Arizona Cardinals, an advantageous matchup in its own right, whether it is on the ground or through the air, Deebo Samuel should find himself a lot more success, similar in which he did last season in week 15 against the Arizona Cardinals, 4 grabs for 48 and 2 receiving touchdowns, over 18.5 fantasy points within that game. Most recently, we've seen McLaurin, 7 catches, 52 and a touchdown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, 7 catches, 75 and a touchdown. We've seen a lot of wide receivers find success against this Arizona Cardinals secondary, and considering Brandon Ayuk really hasn't been able to show up thus far this season, it leads to a lot more opportunity in Deebo's direction. Number 11, we have Drake London. Speaking of opportunity, thus far this season, over the course of the last 3 games, Drake London has had 28 total targets. That's 9.3 targets per game, and that's 30% of the overall target share within this offense. Now, unfortunately, the biggest drought of overall yardage from Drake London is primarily because Kirk Cousins isn't throwing the ball deep to him. He's not really being given much opportunity in terms of air yards. In the last 3 games, he's been able to get himself 122 receiving yards, but only 133 total air yards. That in itself is very much so concerning in my opinion. We need to go ahead and give him opportunities deep down the field. He's a big-bodied wide receiver that can take advantage of the overall matchup, especially taking on Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay's defense most recently given up 7 catches for 68 to Courtland Sutton, and of course 5 catches for 79 to Jameson Williams. Again, those are big-bodied wide receivers that found success. And even last season, Drake London against his defense in week 14, 10 catches for 172. We're hoping for a big week on Thursday night. Now, speaking of this overall matchup on Thursday night, we have Mike Evans as our number 12 to close out the wide receiver 1 conversation. The fact of the matter is, with Palmer and McMillan out, and of course, the coaching staff wanting to get Mike Evans involved more and more. I mean, we heard this time last week that Todd Bowles was going to get more implementation out of Mike Evans. And I told you guys this time last week, we have to be trading for Mike Evans before the Philadelphia Eagles matchup. And what happened? 14 targets, 8 grabs, 94 and a touchdown. It'll be very difficult to trade for him going forward, and that's just the reason why I wanted to present him last week in that capacity. So in this overall matchup, with no wide receiver help outside of just Godwin and Evans and potential sprinkles of Cade Otton going into the Thursday night game, on a short week, I'm anticipating a lot of success for Mike Evans against a division rival. Number 13, speaking of division rivals or just rivalry games in general, we have a revenge game on our hands with Stefon Diggs taking on his former team, the Buffalo Bills. We have all heard the slights and the different comments from Josh Allen, from Stefon Diggs going back and forth over the course of the offseason. But going into this upcoming week, we have an opportunity here for Stefon Diggs, to be on the right side of history and potentially put up a great performance for us and lead our fantasy teams to the promised land. But this upcoming week, Stefon Diggs is going to send a message, especially considering where the Buffalo Bills struggle the most is stopping opposing slot receiving options. Their current nickel cornerback, in regards to Cam Lewis, he's allowed the 3rd most targets, 3rd most receptions, 3rd most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers within the slot position. The expectation is that Stefon Diggs should be in line for a huge performance here, especially with the entire team kind of rallying behind him in order to elevate him against this former team. Moving on to our number 14 to close out the B tier, it's Marvin Harrison Jr. He has had 3 consecutive games in which he has scored a touchdown, but quite frankly, when you're coming off of a game against the Washington Commanders, in which it is the best matchup at the position, and you are only coming away with 6 targets, it is an absolute disaster of an opportunity that was left up to the table. Again, I blame Kyler Murray. First and foremost, 6 targets for your number 1 receiver against the Commanders in a game in which you are losing by 30 points at one point. Obviously, it's not something that needs to occur, and hopefully this upcoming week they can get on the right track, taking on the San Francisco 49ers, quite literally the 7th best matchup at the position. The anticipation would be that, of course, the Arizona Cardinals will be in a negative game script for a majority of this game, so hopefully Marvin Harrison can go ahead, put up a great performance, get more opportunity share, and hopefully score a touchdown for a 4th consecutive game. Number 15 is Chris Olave. Now, we're not 100% certain as to what his health currently looks like. Obviously, he's still dealing with that hamstring injury. It looked like he tweaked it at the end of the game against the Atlanta Falcons on Sunday. If, in fact, he is going to be limited at practice, we'll have to keep that monitored. But this upcoming week, he takes on the Kansas City Chiefs on Monday Night Football. So unless we have a 100% word on whether or not he's going to play, unless he gets a full participation by Friday or Saturday, it will be a sketchy potential to play him. But nonetheless, as of late, the last 3 games, 80-plus receiving yards in each overall contest. We're continuing to expect success out of Chris Olave based on the volume of opportunity he continues to get every single week. Number 16, it's Michael Pittman Jr. The only reason I have Michael Pittman Jr. at 16 of all numbers is if, in fact, Joe Flacco can potentially be the starting quarterback this week. Now, as this video is being recorded, there's no information regarding whether or not Jonathan Taylor and or Anthony Richardson are going to play. So if Joe Flacco is going to be the starting quarterback taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are quite literally the 5th best matchup at the position, nearly allowing 33 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, the expectation would be a lot of success out of Michael Pittman Jr., especially when we take into account that in the 2nd and 3rd quarter of that game against Pittsburgh, with Joe Flacco, had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 53 receiving yards in just 2 quarters of that game. Imagine a full 4-quarter experience against an advantageous matchup. Could very easily have himself over 100 receiving yards with Joe Flacco and have himself a dominant performance in the same way in which, of course, Joe Flacco elevated Amari Cooper late last season. He could very easily do that this week. for Michael Pittman Jr. Number 17 is Garrett Wilson. They have a very advantageous matchup. The Vikings are allowing 38.28 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. The second best matchup, only behind, very slightly behind, the Washington Commanders, which really wasn't a surprise. But again, considering how great the Minnesota Vikings offense has been, it is forcing opposing offenses to have to throw for majority of games. And we have seen wide receivers like Deebo Samuel, 8 catches for 110. Nico Collins, 4 catches for 86. Diggs, 10 for 94. Wicks, 5 for 78 and 2 touchdowns. Jayden Reed, 7 for 139 and a touchdown. Obviously, Garrett Wilson hasn't played up to par thus far this season, only has a 59% catch rate. But we have seen weirder things in London, and we're hoping for Garrett Wilson to get back on track in a matchup in which, of course, they'll be throwing for majority of this game. Number 18, we have Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who over the course of the last 2 weeks has been incredible, has been able to see himself a 24% target share in the last 2 games. Again, a huge upgrade in comparison to weeks 1 and 2. And now has an opportunity of taking on the Indianapolis Colts, quite literally the 6th best matchup at the position. Most recently, the Indianapolis Colts have given up over 100 yards to pretty much everyone. George Pickens, 7 for 113. Romeo Doubs, 6 for 112 and a touchdown. And Nico Collins, 6 for 117. Brian Thomas Jr. as the primary outside receiver, it could be argued that role does belong to Gabe Davis, but ultimately the preferred number 1 outside receiver in this offense is Brian Thomas Jr. and going forward is going to continue to find success, especially going up against the Indianapolis Colts secondary that has struggled all season long. Number 19 is Terry McLaurin, who very similar to Brian Thomas Jr. over the course of the last 2 weeks has finally seen himself a high volume of opportunity. Specifically, when we talk about the opportunity share, 29% target share is what we're talking about. As long as he's continuing to get a high volume of targets, a premier option within this offense, considering how well Jayden Daniels has played over the course of this season. Again, an 82% passing completion percentage is ridiculous. They take on the Cleveland Browns, which again is a matchup which we have seen thus far this season can be taken advantage of. Malik Nabers had himself a field day, so why not Terry McLaurin? Of course, being given opportunities down the field in terms of 20 plus yards down the field, but also being given opportunities, relatively close to the line of scrimmage, which obviously doesn't help in terms of his overall yak or his ADOT. But when you're getting 10 targets, we're not going to complain. That opportunity share is enough to lead us to ranking him within the top 20 in the given matchup. Number 20, we have DJ Moore. Speaking of rivalry games, besides Stefon Diggs taking on the Buffalo Bills, we have DJ Moore taking on his former team, the Carolina Panthers. Now, of course, DJ Moore thus far this season hasn't been, consistent every single week, but in terms of fantasy production last week against the LA Rams, really didn't need to throw the ball very much. They found so much success out of DeAndre Swift in the running game. Ultimately, it just led to, Caleb Williams relaxing, now really having to, air the ball out as much as he typically has over the course of thus far this season. So DJ Moore was able to get lucky, scored a touchdown at the back of the end zone, and was able to finish with 9.7 fantasy points. But now that he takes on the Panthers, again, we have seen wide receivers find themselves in abundance of success. Chase for 3 catches, 85 and a touchdown. Myers, 7 for 62 and a touchdown in that same game. Of course, Trey Tucker had himself a huge performance. Quentin Johnston for 51 and 2 touchdowns. Rashid Shaheed, 73 and a touchdown. We have seen this defense for the Carolina Panthers allow huge plays in terms of chunk yardage against them. Shaheed a 59-yard reception. Johnston a 29-yard reception. Tucker a 54-yard reception. Even Jamar Chase last week took a 13-yard grab and took it to 63 yards. So there's a lot of opportunity here in which DJ Moore should have himself a huge revenge game against his former organization. Number 21. We have T. Higgins. T. Higgins, amongst all receiving options in week 4 for the Cincinnati Bengals, led in terms of total targets. 10 targets, 6 catches, and 60 receiving yards. And going forward, especially against the Baltimore Ravens this week, we are anticipating a negative game script, especially considering Derrick Henry in the running game is going to completely slice through the Cincinnati Bengals run-stop defense. We're anticipating for, of course, T. Higgins and Jamar Chase to take advantage of the 10th best matchup at the wide receiver position. Therefore, in the second half of this game, we're hoping for a lot of opportunity, very similar to early last season. In week 2, Joe Burrow and T. Higgins taking on the Baltimore Ravens. T. Higgins had himself 12 targets, 8 catches, 89 and 2 touchdowns for 25 fantasy points. We're hoping for very similar numbers and potential for upside. Moving on to our number 22, we have George Pickens. George Pickens last week, of course, set career highs, not only in receptions, but also targets. When you're able to get yourself a high volume of opportunity in comparison to where he has been prior in his career with terrible quarterback play from Kenny Pickett, from Mason Rudolph, from Mitchell Trubisky, now that you have the best Justin Fields that we have seen in many of years, we're in a situation in which George Pickens is finally able to elevate to his overall upside. 7 catches on 11 targets, 113 receiving yards going into this upcoming week. Again, when you take on the Dallas Cowboys, even though typically it is seen as a difficult matchup. We have seen a lot of wide receivers find success. Nabers just last week, 12 grabs for 115. And a couple weeks prior to that, Shaheed, 4 catches for 96 and a touchdown. Even Olave was able to get himself over 80 receiving yards within that game. George Pickens is in line for another huge week in terms of opportunity and, receiving yardage. Now, as for a touchdown, very much so difficult, especially considering how, mobile Justin Fields is within the red zone. Number 23, we have Rashid Shaheed. After watching the last couple games of Rashid Shaheed, he has truly become, slowly but surely, a complete wide receiver. He is no longer just a deep ball threat. And even though he is succeeding still in the deep ball receiving game, this offense really is putting him into positions to succeed. 11 targets, 8 grabs, 83 receiving yards this last week against the Atlanta Falcons. And for a second consecutive week in a row, dropped a receiving touchdown. Now, it could be argued that the coverage in this most recent game in the end zone in which he was given that target made the play. But honestly, he should have made that grab and he should have scored a touchdown for a second consecutive week. Unfortunately, dropping them. Going forward, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, if in fact we're going to be in a situation in which Olave is limited, Rashid Shaheed is an even bigger threat within the fantasy realm. But if in fact Olave is in, it just gives more opportunity for the number 2 overall coverage to be taking on Rashid Shaheed within an upcoming week. And it only takes one play for him to be fantasy relevant. 24. We have Dontayvion Wicks, who looked incredible this last week. And with Christian Watson dealing with a high ankle sprain, it is only going to continue to allow for more opportunity to go in the direction of Dontayvion Wicks, taking on the 9th best matchup at the position, 30.3 fantasy points per game. Thus far this season, wide receivers on the outside by the name of Jameson Williams went for 5 catches, 121 and a touchdown. Marvin Harrison, 4 catches, 130 and 2 touchdowns. Juwan Jennings, 11 for 175 and 3 touchdowns against this LA Rams secondary. And even though the Chicago Bears didn't do much within the passing game, even DJ Moore still scored a touchdown last week. There is a lot of opportunity here. And even though there could be a huge game out of Reed and, potentially even Romeo Doubs, which could end up lessening the overall impact of a Dontayvion Wicks performance, for those of you who picked him up, the reason why we picked him up is because we're instantly playing him going into the overall matchup. Moving on to our number 25, we have Amari Cooper, who takes on quite literally the best matchup at the position, allowing 39.58 fantasy points per game. Both Amari Cooper and Jerry Jeudy should find success, especially considering they're going to be in a negative game script. The Washington Commanders offense has looked incredible, and thus far this season, they have forced a lot of teams into negative game scripts. So hopefully, we're going to see a lot of opportunity from Amari Cooper in the second half of this game. But last week, Amari Cooper, even though many of you may think it was a dud performance, he had a 70-yard reception called back because of a holding. And quite frankly, that holding wasn't even, consequential within the overall play. Could have very easily just been a non-call because he would have never got there anyway. But either way, 70 yards and a touchdown, 13 fantasy points siphoned away from his overall total. We would have seen another consecutive week of a huge performance, but this upcoming week, Amari Cooper is going to get us back on track with a huge game against Washington secondary. Number 25, we have Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk's overall ranking could lower over the course of this week if we get more information regarding Evan Ingram. In the last 2 games in which they have prepared for Christian Kirk to be the primary slot receiving option, without Evan Ingram in the lineup, he has seen a 28% target share and, of course, found himself an abundance of success, coming off of a week in which he had 12 targets, 7 catches, 61 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown against the Houston Texans. Now takes on the Indianapolis Colts. Last season against the Colts, of course, was able to get himself double-digit fantasy points, score a touchdown. But again, the Colts secondary cannot stop a soul. The Colts defense cannot stop a soul. We should see the Jacksonville Jaguars find their most success as an offense thus far this season within the upcoming matchup. Number 27, speaking of the Indianapolis Colts, we have Josh Downs. Very similar in which I talked about Michael Pittman Jr. earlier on in today's episode. If in fact Joe Flacco is going to be the starting quarterback, we are firing up Josh Downs for the given week to be a starter in a top 30 capacity. Coming off a week in which he had 9 targets, 8 grabs, 82 and a touchdown, Joe Flacco certainly elevating him into that overall conversation. And the fact that the Jacksonville Jaguars have allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and opposing slot wide receivers of the capacity of Diggs, 5 catches, 69, Shakir, 6 catches, 72 and a touchdown as of the last 2 games. The expectation would be, of course, a lot of success for Josh Downs if Joe Flacco is the starting quarterback. If it's Anthony Richardson, he could still technically be a top 40 option, but I would anticipate it's going to be a lot more difficult to achieve that for Downs, obviously due to the inaccuracies of Anthony Richardson. Moving on to number 28, Xavier Worthy. Quite literally, besides Kelsey, the only dependable receiving option for fantasy within this offense. And we're going to hope that Patrick Mahomes wants to air it out and give Xavier Worthy multiple opportunities a game to be relevant. Now, in each of the last 3 games, he has only had 4 targets. And he's not going to be transitioned into a slot receiving role to be the next Rashee Rice. That's not going to happen. He primarily lives on the outside, and that's exactly how they're going to have to use him. Going up against the New Orleans Saints this upcoming week, the Saints have given up 12 receptions of 20 or more yards down the field to opposing wide receivers. They're within the top 10 of that overall conversation. So if in fact Xavier Worthy is going to be given the opportunity to take the top off of this opposing defense on Monday Night Football, of course, he could very easily come down with a touchdown and make his singular week off of one play, just in which he did against the Los Angeles Chargers on Sunday. Moving on to our number 29, we have Brandon Ayuk. Brandon Ayuk really just hasn't shown up all season. He is not in full form, and until he gets there, until he proves to us that he is actually reliable, I mean, the number 29 spot, I think, is safe, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, considering, again, the Cardinals are a middle-of-the-pack matchup. You could very easily see a week in which, of course, Kittle, Deebo, and Ayuk all pop off. But unfortunately, again, considering he hasn't played up to his normal standard, it's very difficult to trust him within the overall week. Number 30, speaking of not living up to their overall standard, this is primarily not because of their individual play, but quite frankly, the quarterback play. Tyler Huntley and him were not on the same page. But if, in fact, going into this week against the New England Patriots, they can get on the same page, and Tyler Huntley can deliver at least a couple opportunities down the field to allow Tyreek Hill to make a play, very similar to Xavier Worthy, it quite literally only takes one play to make his entire fantasy week relevant. But considering, again, whether it's Skylar Thompson, Tim Boyle, Tyler Huntley, none of them are Tua. And because of that, it is very difficult to trust any receiving options for the Miami Dolphins offense. But of course, Tyreek Hill, very special wide receiver. All it takes is one play to be relevant. Moving on to our number 31, Xavier Legette. In his first game as an incorporated starter, playing a vast majority of the overall snaps, got himself a total of 12 opportunities, 10 targets, 2 rushing attempts, and 8 total touches. 6 receptions, 66 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. They do take on the Chicago Bears, which again is a solid secondary, and it may be difficult, but ultimately, when he's pulling number 2 coverage, when Diontae Johnson is on the opposite side of the field pulling number 1 coverage, the expect from Jalen Johnson, of course, of all cornerbacks. My expectation is that Xavier Legette against the number 2 cornerback of the Chicago Bears will continue to get himself an abundance of opportunity, considering, of course, the Carolina Panthers should probably be throwing the ball for the majority of this game, similar in which they have over the course of the last 2 weeks. Moving on to our number 32, Jordan Addison. The fact of the matter is the number 2 receiving option of this offense has scored a touchdown every single week. Weeks 1 through 3, it was Jalen Nailor. But in the return, Jordan Addison not only gets himself a receiving touchdown, but also a rushing touchdown for 21.4 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Considering how well Sam Darnold has played over the course of the last 4 weeks, 2 or more touchdowns in each of those individual games. In the last 2 games, has 7 total passing touchdowns. The expectation is success for Jordan Addison. Obviously, taking on the New York Jets, it's not an easy matchup, but as a whole, if in fact this offense is going to continue to be relevant, a touchdown could very easily be incorporated within the overall box score of Jordan Addison by the end of the week and could very easily outproduce the number 32 overall rank. Number 33 is Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers, again, is an incredible wide receiver, but when he's coming off of back-to-back weeks of very little incorporation, primarily because they are running the ball and they are running through teams, you know, if you're going to run through the Dallas Cowboys, you're going to run through the Buffalo Bills, it is going to be extremely easy to run through the Cincinnati Bengals defense that, again, does not exist thus far this season. Therefore, if they're going to have a commanding lead and just run out the clock in the second half, I fear that there is going to be another consecutive game in which Zay Flowers doesn't see himself enough opportunity to be fantasy relevant. Number 34, we have Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, again, is an advantageous matchup. The 12th best at the position, nearly allowing 30 fantasy points per game on average. Most recently, we have seen Diontae Johnson, 8 catches, 122 and a touchdown. Zay Flowers, 7 catches, 91 and a touchdown. And if it wasn't for the fact of that holding call, Amari Cooper would have had himself over 100 receiving yards and a touchdown last week against the Las Vegas Raiders defense. The expectation is that, of course, this is going to be a game in which the Denver Broncos are most likely favored, considering how well they have played. As an offense, they haven't been peak, but Courtland Sutton is still getting himself opportunity, 9 targets last week, but was able to find himself wide open against the Jets of all defenses for 3 receptions, 60 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown to close out his week. 35, we have Jakobi Meyers. Speaking of this overall matchup, look, Jakobi Meyers as the primary number 1 wide receiver of this offense is going to be relevant. Is he taking on Patrick Surtain II? Absolutely. But Devontae Adams is probably never going to play another snap for the Raiders again. So if we're going to be in a situation in which Jakobi Meyers is taking on the Denver Broncos, a defense that he has himself an incredible track record against, last season against this defense, 3 catches, 61 and a touchdown, 9 catches, 81 and 2 touchdowns. He's put up incredible performances against this defense in the past, but now has to get trailed by Patrick Surtain, which obviously is going to lessen his overall potential for upside within the given week. Number 36, we have Wan'Dale Robinson. If, in fact, we're in a situation in which Malik Nabers does not clear the concussion protocol, Wan'Dale Robinson is going to jump within the overall rankings, primarily because amongst all wide receivers thus far this season, he is number 4 in terms of total targets and number 5 in terms of total receptions. The opportunity share is far too valuable, and even though he takes on the Seattle Seahawks, who limited Amon-Ra St. Brown has 6 catches, 45 and 1 receiving touchdown with no one else to throw the ball to if in fact Nabers is out. Wan'Dale Robinson should be incorporated for at least 15 targets, very similar to last week in which he had 14 targets and 11 grabs for 71 receiving yards. 37, we have Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who, again, on and off performances. Week 1 did nothing. Week 2 was relevant. Week 3 did nothing. Week 4 was relevant. And if we're going to go back and forth consistently there, that's just not going to be, reliable enough for me to trust them every single week out. But going up against the New York Giants, again, this secondary is their biggest flaw as a defense. They haven't been able to really stop the run over the course of the last couple seasons, but if Geno Smith really wants to put on the pressure, they could really light up this defense with the efforts of Jaxon Smith-Njigba. He just needs the opportunity of targets. If he's going to get those targets, week 3, 3 targets. Week 4, 12 targets. If we can find ourselves in the middle with 8 targets per game, Jaxon Smith will continuously be relevant in the top 40 capacity. Number 38, Khalil Shakir, who did not practice earlier today due to his overall ankle injury. He takes on the Houston Texans, the 11th best matchup at the position. Christian Kirk last week, 7 catches on 12 targets for 61 and a receiving touchdown. If Khalil Shakir is ready to go as the primary slot receiving option of this offense, should find himself a lot of success within the upcoming matchup against the Houston Texans secondary. Number 9, we have Romeo Doubs. Again, Romeo Doubs has one of the best matchups taking on the Los Angeles Rams. He has to compete with Reed, Wicks, Jacobs, and of course Kraft. If all of those options are going to siphon away potential opportunities from him, then we could be in a situation in which Romeo Doubs shows up and does nothing. But we could also be in a situation in which Romeo Doubs is significantly more valuable and ends up being able to lead this team in total targets, receptions, yardage, etc. It's not out of the realm of possibility. Like I mentioned earlier with Dontayvion Wicks, this defense has allowed over 120 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown to Jameson Williams, Marvin Harrison Jr., and Juwan Jennings. So why not Romeo Doubs within the upcoming week? Number 40, we have Jerry Jeudy. The fact of the matter is Jerry Jeudy takes on the best matchup at the position. And even though we do have Amari Cooper significantly higher ranked, when we talk about Jerry Jeudy having himself 70-plus receiving yards in 2 of the last 3 games, he is getting ample opportunity and he's able to deliver. And considering the implicated game script on hand, most likely being the Cleveland Browns throwing for majority of the second half, Jerry Jeudy should find himself, a pretty solid week of overall success. Moving on to our number 41, we have Trey Tucker. While, Jakobi Meyers is on the opposite side of the field, pulling coverage from Patrick Surtain II, the only other relevant options are going to be Brock Bowers and Trey Tucker. Trey Tucker coming off of back-to-back weeks of scoring a touchdown last year against the Denver Broncos in Week 18. 5 catches for 79. If Devontae Adams is out, Trey Tucker is a huge upgrade. And of course, hopefully you picked him up off waivers if you need the help based on the bye week hell of losing, of course, Amon-Ra, Jameson Williams, A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, etc. Moving on to our number 42, Rome Odunze. The fact of the matter is Rome Odunze, in the last 3 weeks, is leading the NFL in terms of total air yards. They're giving him opportunities deep down the field. We have seen Shaheed, Johnston, Tucker all have themselves receptions of 29 or more receiving yards down the field. Even Jamar Chase took a 13-yard reception and went for 63 against this Carolina Panthers defense. The expectation is that they're going to give him opportunities. All it takes is one play to be able to take the top off of an opposing defense and make your fantasy week. The final player I wanted to mention is Tutu Atwell. This very easily could have been Jordan Whittington based on the volume of opportunity that Whittington got last week, but Tutu Atwell, back-to-back weeks of getting himself, in the realm of 75-plus receiving yards. If we're going to once again see that, taking on the Green Bay Packers in a game in which they probably will be throwing the ball for a lot of that second half, Atwell, who's playing a lot of his overall snaps within the slot position, should find himself success within the overall week. All right, that's going to cover my top 43 wide receiver rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you enjoyed today's content, click the like button down below. Subscribe if you haven't yet already. I'll be live streaming later tonight around 7:15 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Be sure to swing on by if you have any questions. Again, I'll be back tomorrow with my tight end and quarterback rankings. Appreciate you all for all the support. Until tomorrow, thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.